Okay, and just the slideshow, not my notes or anything? Great. Okay, so happy Preservation Week. Thank you for joining me today to talk about collections, disaster planning, and response in the university library. So I'm Shelby Strommer. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Collections Care Coordinator and Preservation Services. I'm also a volunteer with the National Heritage Responders, which is a group of professionals who provide assistance to cultural heritage institutions when they're experiencing disasters. So this is a topic I'm really excited about. If you're not familiar with collections care, we're a programmatic area within preservation services. We have a binding specialist, a GA, and 2 grad hourlies, and we coordinate the environmental monitoring and IPM. We deal with commercial library binding and are the first point of contact for circulating materials that need some kind of preservation treatment or rehousing. And we also take on some of the leadership and planning for collections disasters. So today we're going to talk briefly about why disaster planning is important and what it actually is. I'm also going to talk through what we do specifically in the university library, including the disaster team, the disaster plan, disaster supplies, and who to contact. And at the end, we should have time for questions. So first, I want to start with a quick poll. Let's see if I know how to launch it. Okay, so true or false, I know what to do in a collections-related emergency. I just kind of want to gauge the temperature of the room. I'll give a couple more seconds to answer. Maybe like 2 more seconds. Okay. So hopefully you are looking at the results right now. About half of you said maybe. 31% said true. 15% said false, and hopefully we will change that by the end of the presentation today. So, why is disaster planning important? Disaster planning is a big part of our preventative preservation program and part of our duty as stewards of cultural heritage and research collection. Our collections support the research and teaching and learning and clinical care and creative work at our institution and around the world. And the university has invested in these materials, and we've agreed to be the library of record for a lot of these collections. Large-scale events can be catastrophic and are hopefully rare. Small-scale events can be much more likely and still potentially disastrous. So basic preparedness can greatly reduce the impact of an event. I like to joke that I really like disaster planning because it combines 2 of my favorite things, worrying and documentation. So thinking through the worst case scenarios and how to respond means you can be more ready if something does happen, and you can respond more efficiently and effectively. And staff training is an essential part of this process. I can do all the disaster planning I want, but if no one else is on board, it's not going to be very useful. So what is disaster planning really? You might hear it called disaster planning, emergency planning, disaster response planning. In the larger emergency response community, they describe the emergency response cycle. So it's comprised of 4 main parts: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And the important thing to know is that it isn't just one thing then the other than the other. The process is ongoing and overlapping. And in our specific context, we're focusing on collections, but also operations and safety. And like most parts of preventative preservation, it's a joint effort across the library. So that first quadrant focuses on mitigation and assessment. So we start by thinking through what kind of disasters are the institutions likely to face, including external factors like severe weather or flooding, wildfires, earthquakes, civil unrest, theft and vandalism. And then internal factors may include things like leaky pipes, leaky roofs, mold and pest infestations, construction or renovations, inadequate fire protection, structural or shelving failures. So of all the possible disasters we may face, we think about both the probability that they could happen and also how severe the potential impact would be. Then that helps us prioritize what to plan for and to think through things that we can proactively do to reduce the probability and severity. So you may have seen a prioritization tool like this quadrant before. So basically, we start with things that are in the high probability, high severity quadrant. Water events are the most likely to occur in a cultural heritage institution, including ours, and they can come from severe weather, pipe leaks, building leaks, flash floods, sometimes other disasters like severe weather or fire turns into a water disaster. So mitigation examples might include repairing the building envelope, cleaning out drains and gutters, not storing collections directly on the floor because that's where water pools. It might also include maintaining a contract and a working relationship with a disaster vendor or training staff on how to salvage water disaster items, which doesn't necessarily decrease the likelihood of an event, but lessens the potential impact by ensuring a quick response. So other mitigation examples include maintaining HVAC equipment and fire suppression systems, housekeeping and food policies that mitigate pests and mold and food damage to collections, sealing the building envelope to keep out bugs and water, security policies like not allowing coats or bags in a special collections reading room, and backing up data, both institutional records and digital collections. So the preparedness quadrant of that emergency response cycle focuses on making sure staff know what to do in an emergency. What are the procedures? How do we communicate with each other? Who contacts who? Where do we find necessary supplies and services? What are our salvage priorities? What's our plan for continuity of operations, which is essentially how do we continue the necessary functions of the library, like reference, circulation, making sure staff are paid, and understanding what happens with both IT infrastructure and data. And so that's where the disaster plan comes in, and I'll talk about how that works at UIUC in particular a little bit later in the presentation. So during the response and salvage quadrant, that refers to the actions that we actually take when a disaster happens. So this includes the first discovery and notification of an event, assessing the scale and impact of the incident, and of course, whatever steps we take to triage and salvage collection materials. And I know I'm talking about collection emergencies, but I need to emphasize that our first priority is always human life, safety, and health, both physical and mental health. So after the bulk of the actual hands-on salvage work is done, we get to the long-term recovery process. This can be really lengthy. It could be a large or small cleanup process. It might include ongoing treatment like drying or mold remediation of damaged materials, either in-house or through a disaster vendor. It could also include building restoration in the case of fire or severe weather, potentially replacing furniture and IT equipment, reshelving materials, both things that were not damaged as well as later reshelving materials after treatment is complete. Metadata cleanup, including processing anything that was withdrawn as a result of the disaster, updating holdings records, tracking materials that are still being treated, and eventually processing materials as they return. And the resumption of services, which is again the continuity of operations, has likely been going on sort of the whole time throughout the initial response as well. But we need to focus on where do staff work if their building is not inhabitable? Do we need to set up an alternate service point? So a good example of continuity of operations during an emergency is something like curbside delivery during COVID. But I also want to point out that during the disaster process, we want to document everything. So losses, expenses, staff time, insurance estimates, tracking where collections go, decisions that were made along the way. That's all incredibly important for things like insurance and financial reasons, as well as to maintain intellectual and physical control over the collections. And it can be a good time to think about ways to more effectively prevent or respond to future disasters. So how does this all work at UIUC? I'm going to talk about what it looks like in practice, who's involved, and what you, library employee, can do in a collections disaster. So first, I have another quick poll. Maybe. Okay, so where can I find the library collections disaster plan? The library wiki, the Preservation Services website, in a box folder, or that's a trick question, we don't have one. Give like 5 more seconds. Okay. So 25% of folks said the library wiki. Half of you said the Preservation Services website. A couple folks said the box folder, and one person said that's a trick question. We don't have one. Okay. So, oh, the answer is it's on the library wiki. The collection disaster plan lives on the new wiki. It was ported over from the old wiki. And just as an aside, there might be a few things that I still need to clean up and broken links and whatnot. So if you do take a look at it, just keep that in mind. There are links to it from the Preservation Services part of the website, but it actually lives in the wiki. So it basically outlines all the key information that we need to know before and during a disaster. So it has a list of the disaster team members and all their contact info, as well as the duties for each role outlined in the disaster plan. It breaks down the preparedness and response steps for common library disasters, like fire, water, renovations, severe weather, and earthquakes. It has ready reference information like procedures, the location of disaster supplies, and information to material-specific salvage. And it's applicable to all campus libraries. I should say there is an additional manual for Oak Street in particular because it's a high density storage facility. And so a large scale disaster would look a lot different in that environment. And so that serves as an addendum to the regular disaster plan. But the regular collections disaster plan is applicable to all of the departmental libraries around campus. So I mentioned the disaster team. I think there are 14 different roles on the team. And so each of those roles has a primary staff designee and at least one alternate, because you never know who's going to be out of town or unavailable during an incident. And disaster response is extremely collaborative. And so we have members from across different library units. In preservation services, we have the disaster recovery officer, also called the DRO. That's the head of preservation, Jennifer. And so she's the leader of the entire disaster recovery operation. Everyone else on the team reports up to her. We also have an assigned assistant DRO, and then other folks in preservation are assigned roles that include leading the hands-on salvage and recovery process of collections and written and photographic documentation. Facilities folks are in charge of the actual logistics of facilities and transportation and ordering the supplies and finding locations to set up and stage recovery efforts. And maybe we need to temporarily move collections to a new location, or a lot of coordinating with campus FNS, dealing with, trash removal, parking, where can we put a vendor truck? All of the logistics. Security is another important one. So then in admin, we have AULs who are in charge of representing the collections and selectors and making decisions about salvage priorities. And of course, our chief communications officer is in charge of coordinating all the messaging. So Heather would work with the dean to communicate with campus. She'd be in charge of communicating with public and the media and all the PR involved. BHRSC staff would help with all things related to human resources and business. So that includes staffing needs for the recovery, the actual health and safety of staff, authorizing funds and procuring supplies and equipment and services, and dealing with insurance claims and risk management. IT folks would help coordinate both the technology equipment and networking needs for the recovery efforts, as well as making decisions about any IT equipment that's damaged in the incident. And then there are also folks across other units who play essential roles. So for example, the head of CAS is in charge of library services and continuity of operations. CMS staff have designated essential roles in the logistics of an Oak Street disaster. And then we also have some volunteers from other units who would essentially be our first call if we need more bodies to help pack out and move materials. And so that's not to say that those are the only people involved in an emergency. Those are the folks who have a named role and are in charge of those specific areas of the recovery and have defined duties. Many, many other people are inevitably involved, especially the larger the disaster is. I should also mention that this team is only activated in a larger scale disaster. So if we're dealing with a small incident, like say 100 books get a little bit wet when a pipe leaks, That would really just involve maybe facilities handling things from the building perspective, and then me and whoever's around the preservation office dealing with the books. So who do you contact in a disaster? So if you discover a collections disaster, the most important thing to know is who to contact and how to report it. Of course, if there is a health or safety emergency, you would call 911. We also have the BEEP and the EAT plans I should mention, and so those provide more guidance on other kinds of disasters and emergency situations, which is separate from what I'm talking about today. Those are managed by facilities, but they're still important to be aware of. So when you discover a disaster, during business hours, contact library facilities. After 4 or on weekends and university holidays, the first call is to UIPD. And so if collections are impacted, contact preservation services. That's the number to our main office line. If it's after hours or for some reason no one answers the phone, I don't recommend leaving a voicemail. Your next best option is to hang up and call me or even Jennifer. Those are our work numbers and they simultaneously ring our cell phones. We're going to be updating our outgoing voice message soon to indicate that. If you need a timely response, your best bet is to call someone directly if you don't get an answer in the office. You can also call the conservation lab during business hours as well. So we have this handy chart that I think my predecessor Miriam originally created. You can post it near circulation desks and in staff work areas. If you don't already have a copy or you have an outdated copy, email me and I'm happy to send you one. It's also on the library website in the collections care section of the preservation services pages. It specifically focuses on water because water incidents are by far the most common in our library. But the main steps are to contact facilities, contact preservation, and find your red emergency tote with supplies. So speaking of the red disaster totes, do you know where to find the nearest one? Let's see if I can launch another poll. Okay. So yes, maybe, I think so. No, I have no idea what you're even talking about. I'll give you like 10 more seconds to respond. Okay, that's everybody. So luckily no one said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that's great. Most folks said either yes or yes, I think so. A handful of folks said no. That's okay, because I'll tell you. So this is an example of what one of the red disaster totes looks like. We have them throughout the campus libraries. In the main stacks, we have totes on every single deck of the east stacks. They're all in the exact same place, right on top of each other. And they're right across from the green elevator. And they also have supplies in the book stacks office. We also have totes in the departmental libraries and in special collections units. Some units have more than one. And my GA does an annual inventory, but if you end up using any of the supplies from your disaster tote, please reach out to me afterward so I can make sure your kit is restocked so that you have them next time something happens. And so this shows you what we keep inside each kit. We have packages of paper towels, large pieces of plastic sheeting and duct tape in case we need to cover shelves. There's a headlamp with spare batteries in case the power goes out. And those gray things are absorbent socks and pillows, which can trap a lot of liquid. The brand is Pig, so you'll usually hear them called pig pillows or pig socks or pig snakes. And they are really great in case of a water incident. So these are some of our additional disaster supplies that we keep centrally located in the main library. So we have large fans. We also have several box fans that aren't pictured. We have buckets, freezer paper, absorbent floor mats, caution tape, these floor dams that expand on contact with water and then act as a floor barrier so leaks can't spread any further. We have tons of documentation supplies, like clipboards and markers and labels and legal pads and a utility knife and scissors and nitrile gloves and other PPE, like particulate filtering masks and disposable aprons and waterproof shoe covers. And underneath all of that in the picture, you can see we also have milk crates. So if we need to move a lot of wet materials, we're ready to pack out. And this is an example of some of our disaster supplies in action. So there's a roof leak above these shelves in preservation. When it rains, we drape the plastic sheeting over the shelves. In this case, these are actually inexpensive shower curtains. We also buy large rolls of plastic sheeting from home improvement stores and cut them down, and that's what's in those disaster kits. We also have one of the pig socks at the bottom. You can sort of see at the bottom of the photo to catch any water that runs down the plastic to keep it from spreading across the floor and becoming a safety hazard too. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about what we do with wet books, because water disasters are the most common incident, because it can include water, pouring down from the ceiling of wet stacks and running, 3 or 4 decks down, or a giant box of new GovDocs acquisitions that gets absolutely soaked during delivery, or an HVAC leak over a cart of materials in a workroom that covers everything in coolant. And those are all things that have happened in the 4 years since I've worked here. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about what happens with wet books. There is a risk of mold growth in just a couple of days in the right conditions, so we want to move quickly. The course of action also really depends on how many materials we're talking about, which will determine whether we can handle it in-house, whether we need to bring in a vendor to help. Books, documents, AV media, and different photographic processes need different strategies, so you need to know what collection formats we're dealing with. And the degree of wetness also matters. We can often air dry some damp or slightly wet books, but if we're dealing with books that are really saturated and dripping wet, or we have way too many to air dry all at once, we can freeze them to prevent mold growth, and that buys us more time. Then we could, for example, air dry them in batches. And we also can't forget about the dry books. If our collection space is damp and it's a situation where we can't get the environment under control, we might need to relocate the dry books so they're not susceptible to mold too. So if we're dealing with like really soiled, soaked books, for example, muddy books after a flood or a hurricane, we would rinse them first. So you hold them firmly closed and dunk them in basically a bucket of water, and then another bucket of water, and another bucket of water, until basically the water is clear. I should also mention, though, if we're dealing with black water, aka sewage, we would call in a vendor who's authorized to deal with that biohazard on collection materials. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then this picture illustrates air drying bound volumes, which we have done numerous times in the last few years. So in this process, we interleave paper towels to absorb the excess moisture and position the books on an end, upright, in a location with a lot of table space and good air circulation. And then typically bring in box fans to help with the circulation. And so then as the paper towels absorb water, we swap them out for dry ones, and we put them in between different pages and rotate the books from head to tail. If we're dealing with glossy clay-coated pages, those pages will just fuse together if they are allowed to dry touching each other, and they form a block that you just can't separate. So to prevent the blocking, we would interleave every single page so that the coated pages don't touch each other. If we're dealing with things like thin pamphlets that won't stand up on their own, we can hang them over a clothesline to dry. I don't have a good picture of that though, unfortunately. So the downside to air drying is that it takes a lot of labor and space and time. You also have the potential for a lot of warping and tide lines, and the inks and dyes can run. And you have to be careful to maintain a decent humidity level and airflow to prevent mold. So I mentioned freezing earlier. Generally, we would use this option to buy more time. In that case, our best bet is a freezer that gets things really cold really fast. Household freezers can work, but if they don't get cold enough fast enough, you can end up with ice crystals, which can damage the materials. So an ideal situation is a blast freezer or a frost-free freezer that can be maintained at least 10 degrees below Fahrenheit, or -10 Fahrenheit, to freeze anything slowly. Or to dry things very slowly in a freezer, I've been told you can use a frost-free freezer that will take potentially months and months and months and months. So in preservation, we have a chest freezer and some other fancier freezers, and we often use them to deactivate mold and pests as well. So if we're dealing with a lot of materials, we would work with a disaster recovery vendor to arrange vacuum freeze drying. There's also thermal freeze drying, and basically in that process, the books are frozen and then they get like a little bit warm so that the water turns from a solid to a liquid and then evaporates. The problem with that is then you end up with that wet phase in the middle. So the thing about vacuum freeze drying, which is super cool, is that they use this process called sublimation to take the water directly from the solid ice phase to the gas phase without becoming a liquid first. So the phase of water, whether it's a solid or a liquid or a gas, depends on the temperature and the atmospheric pressure. And the atmospheric pressure impacts how water reacts to temperature. So that's why you have a lower boiling point of water if you're at a high altitude, for example. So this chart shows how a combination of pressure and temperature determine the state of water. Closer to the top, with higher levels of pressure, as you increase the temperature, the water changes from a solid to a liquid to a vapor. But if you reduce the pressure by using a vacuum freeze dryer and you increase the temperature slightly, the water will get warm enough to thaw, but it doesn't have enough atmospheric pressure to take the form of a liquid, so it goes straight to a gas. And honestly, it's not super important that you know that, but I think it's really cool. So thank you for bearing with me. So that's the deal with books, but what about other formats? If we're dealing with flat paper and documents and manuscripts, we can air dry them on a flat surface. You can also hang them on clotheslines with clothespins if you need more space. You can also vacuum freeze dry them, and they can be frozen if you need to buy more time. Vellum and leather, and especially dealing with special collections, should not air dry. We would want to keep it wet or freeze right away until it can be vacuum freeze dried. There's also apparently a new proprietary method called thermaline or cryogenic drying, specifically designed for special collections, but I don't know much about it yet. But that's also an option, apparently. Photographs should be air dried. Whether or not you can freeze them to buy more time to air dry really depends on the photographic process. So some things like daguerreotypes and collodion photographs like ambrotypes and tintypes cannot be frozen. Other things might be fine to freeze. So especially if we need to air dry in large batches, you can freeze some of them while you air dry the others. Film, so specifically like photographic negatives and microfilm can air dry. You can freeze it to buy time, but that's not something we would vacuum freeze. That's really an air dry situation. We also do not want to freeze AV recordings like magnetic tapes or optical discs or computer media. We want to air dry those. In some cases, like say with the VHS or cassette tapes, like magnetic media, because we don't want to freeze them, it's better to just rinse them in distilled water and keep them wet if we can't treat them right away. So that's sort of how we would respond to disasters within the library. So what can you as a library employee do to be more prepared? The first step is just increasing your awareness of collections disasters. And the good news is you're doing that right now. So you can also keep an eye out for potential problems that you happen to see, like reporting a small leak before it turns into a bigger issue, or simple steps like keeping collections off the floor, reporting pest sightings, letting me know if your collections environment seems unusually humid. You can also become familiar with the disaster plan. You do not have to memorize it, and you honestly don't even have to read the whole thing. But just knowing that we have one and where to find it and what information is in there is a great first step. You could also post the water response diagram, or if you have it posted, make sure it's the most current version. So let me know if you need a copy and I can send you a PDF. And when you hire new staff, maybe part of the onboarding process is just pointing out the water response diagram or letting them know that a disaster plan exists. And if you're a subject selector, you might want to consider your collection salvage priorities. So if there's a disaster, Tom Tepper is the collections representative on the disaster team and leads the salvage decisions, sometimes in consultation with the selectors. So factors to consider include things like items that directly support the collecting mission of the institution, unique and vital and valuable or irreplaceable items, things that are most prone to continued damage, vital institutional records, any items on loan from other institutions. So if you already have a good sense of your collection priorities, then you'll be ready if Tom Tepper has to come to you and say, let's talk salvation prioritization. So before I go, I just have one final poll, if I can launch it. Okay, what would you do if you discovered a collections disaster? Contact facilities and preservation, nothing, run away and hope someone else deals with it. Oh, okay. So almost everybody said contact facilities and preservation, and you are right. Somebody said run away and hope someone else deals with it. Why do I feel like that was Will Schlock? I don't know. I could be wrong. So the correct answer is, of course, contact facilities and preservation. Oh, I see in chat, I was right. It was Will. Okay. So that brings us to the end of my talk about disaster planning and collections response. Thank you so much to everybody who joined me this morning. And thank you to Rachel Miller-Houghton for all her work planning and promoting all of our Preservation Week events this week. So now we have some time for questions. If you want to ask in chat or unmute and ask aloud, if you don't feel like asking now or you think of something later, you can also always email me if you think of questions. No questions? Rachel says, do people know if they're on the disaster team? They should. So every year I send out the contact list to the disaster response team and ask everyone to check their contact information. And I also send them a description of their specific position and just ask everybody to review it. So that's a really good point. Yes, if you're on the disaster team, you should know. I also should mention, we do some kind of disaster response training, ideally every other year. So actually we have something planned for the disaster team next week, and those folks have all been invited to a morning long tabletop exercise. So my GA, Danny, has prepared a disaster scenario, and we will all talk through the steps we would take in the actual disaster as if it was happening. It's not like the disaster response like physical practice, like if you've seen Parks and Rec, there's a notable episode where they act out an actual disaster. This one is just discussion based, but it's a good way to test the disaster plan and also make sure everybody knows what their role is. So that's something that we have as part of our training for the disaster team. Any other questions, comments? Do folks feel more confident that they would know what to do if they were the first to discover a collections disaster? Do you feel like you understand how disasters work now, or disaster response works? Okay, folks are not chatty. That's okay. So thank you again, everybody, and thank you, Rachel. If you have questions or you run into questions in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out via email, on Teams. I'm always happy to talk about things related to collections care in general or disasters. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Shelby.